Thank you for joining us. Will you set out your vision for 2030, Ray?
2030 is going to be an astonishing period in the 21st century. We have got major problems between now and 2030, but we've got significant and outstanding opportunities. Overall, life is going to be much better for most people in the world by 2030.
What we've just seen looks fairly bleak. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
No, I think it's an assessment from 2008, and that's always a dangerous thing to make. We have got real problems like the food crisis, we've got climate crisis, but we can, and I'm sure we will, overcome them. A simple look at history says that over a 25-year period, except for the terrible problems of Hitler and Stalin in the 20th century, humanity has gone forward. Things have got better. There is, in fact, profound cause for optimism.
You must, though, have concerns. What are they?
My biggest concern is world population growth. Explosion would be a better word. I mean, 6.7 billion now, somewhere about 8 point something by 2030, and then ever upwards. How are we going to find them water? How are we going to find food? How are we going to find energy? And of course, climate crisis. I don't like the phrase climate change or global warming. These sound like euphemisms for an extreme weather future that is going to cause us serious problems.
What happens first? What's the biggest problem first?
Right. The food crisis is made by humans, because major governments decided that they wanted to produce biofuels using crops. The United States government, the French government, some other governments subsidised growing crops to feed our cars instead of to feed people. What craziness. And it isn't even carbon efficient. We do not have internationally an organised food production system. We have many, many millions of acres of agricultural land in the world set aside, much of it in Europe, some in the USA, especially in Eastern Europe. We now have to tackle the food crisis with a massive effort of replanting, rethinking and replanning. The truth is, it's a crisis of supply today. It isn't really a big-scale problem.
Interesting, because many people will say that their biggest concern, their biggest fear is of food supply going forward. Do you think science can alleviate that?
I do. I think there are all sorts of new types of agriculture which will come and which will, for example, increase output from a given field tenfold. Many farms in Africa are producing a tenth of what they could be producing without moving to GMO crops. There are abilities to improve agriculture all over the world. We just haven't had the incentive to do so until now.
Should it be the role of the government going forward to protect food supplies?
Well, don't you think that food security is the first job of government? Feed its people. Isn't that number one? I mean, we used to think back in the Second World War, back in the First World War, that being self-sufficient was what each country had to be. But we've grown lazy, we've grown lax, we've relied upon international trade to provide food. We will still have to provide international trade for food, but we've got to have some sort of international coordination, and the World Food Agency doesn't have enough powers to do it.
Let's talk about GM crops. There is an awful lot of suspicion around the very term GM. Mm-hmm. Is it time to abandon that technology?
No. Why on earth would you suggest we should? I mean, most of the suspicion about GM is in Europe. And that goes back to the 1990s, when the environmental groups waged a very successful campaign against altering genetic modified plants. In fact, it can bring enormous benefits and help to feed millions of people in areas where other crops would not grow.
After the break, Ray, we're going to talk about climate change. Your thoughts ahead of the break?
Probably climate crisis is the biggest real problem we all face.
You say climate crisis instead of climate change. Why?
Because climate change doesn't transmit the real urgency of the problem. It is something amazing, large, important, and in front of us now.
We started by talking about your vision for 2030. We've heard an awful lot of other people talking about where they think we're going now on in. a considered view going forward?
Most of the doomsayers are mistaken. And the reason is that they aren't futurologists. They're looking at the future with what I call the bias of the present, as though they were looking at it through today's lens. And what you have to do is factor in all of the technologies and social changes which will interact over the next 25 years.
So if I say to you 9 billion people by 2030, you say what?
An ever-growing consumer market that we have to find the water, energy and food for.
If I say to you, to the north, an escalating race for energy resources, you say?
There is energy all around us. We have energy from the sun every day that could, if it were properly harnessed, provide all the energy we need.
If I say to you, to the south, riots on the streets over the prices of food, you say?
Well, the food crisis is man-made. We can solve it within a season or two.
If I say robots?
I say bring them on.